Welcome to the Quotive Corner, where we take a few minutes. Whether you're barely starting your day, calling it a day, or just on a short break, to reflect on a single idea, not just to hear a quote, but to really ponder it. Because sometimes the most powerful insights are the ones that quietly describe something we've already experienced, but haven't fully confronted. Today's quote comes from Brazilian author Paulo Coelho from his book, The Alchemist. A mistake repeated more than once is a choice. At first, this feels a little harsh, because most people don't like to think of their mistakes as choices. Mistakes feel accidental, unintentional, something that just happened, something you didn't mean to do, something you wish you could take back. And in many cases, that's true. The first time something goes wrong, it often is a mistake. You didn't know, you misjudged, you reacted instead of thinking. You trusted the wrong person. You ignored something you didn't yet understand. That's part of being human. But this quote isn't about the first time. It's about what happens after. Because the moment something repeats, something changes. Now you have information. Now you have awareness. Now you've seen the outcome. And that's where the line between mistake and choice begins to blur. Not immediately, and not always clearly, but inevitably. Because once you know, continuing the same pattern is no longer just an accident. It becomes a decision. Maybe not a loud, obvious decision, but a quiet one, a passive one, a decision made through inaction, through habit, through avoidance, or through justification. And that's where this quote becomes uncomfortable. Because it shifts responsibility. It takes something we often place outside of ourselves, mistakes, and brings it back inside. Not to assign blame, but to assign ownership. Think about how often patterns repeat in life. The same type of relationship, the same type of reaction, the same type of mistake, different people, different circumstances. But somehow, the outcome feels familiar. And when that happens, the question is no longer, why did this happen? The question becomes, why is this happening again? Because repetition is rarely random. It usually points to something unresolved, something unnoticed, or something you're choosing not to change. That's the deeper layer of what Coelho is getting at. Not that people are careless, but that people are often unaware of how much control they actually have once a pattern reveals itself. And sometimes, that lack of change isn't because change is impossible. It's because change is uncomfortable. It requires effort. It requires honesty. It requires breaking something familiar, even if that familiarity is what keeps producing the same result. And so instead, people repeat. Not because they want to, but because it's easier than confronting what needs to change. That's where the word choice becomes important. Because a choice doesn't always feel like a deliberate action. Sometimes it looks like staying the same. Sometimes it looks like saying, this is just how things are. Sometimes it looks like hoping for a different outcome without changing anything that leads to it. And over time, those small, quiet choices accumulate until what once felt like a mistake starts to feel like a pattern. And what feels like a pattern begins to define direction. That's the real weight of this quote. It's not saying that people are defined by their mistakes. It's saying that people are shaped by what they do after them. Do you adjust? Do you reflect? Do you recognize the pattern and interrupt it? Or do you continue, hoping that somehow the result will be different this time? Because hope without change is not a strategy. It's repetition. And repetition, over time, becomes intention, whether you acknowledge it or not. There's also something else worth noticing here. This quote doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't say you won't make mistakes again. It says that repeating the same mistake without change is where responsibility begins. That's a very different standard. It allows for growth, it allows for learning, but it removes the comfort of pretending that repeated outcomes are beyond your control. And maybe that's the real value of the quote. It gives you a way to look at your life, not through the lens of blame, but through the lens of patterns. Because patterns are visible, patterns are trackable, and most importantly, patterns are changeable, but only if you're willing to see them. So the next time something happens again, something familiar, something frustrating, something you've experienced before, it might be worth pausing for a moment. Not to judge yourself, but to ask a simple question. Is this still a mistake, or has it become a choice? Because the answer to that question tells you something important, not just about what happened, but about what happens next. Thanks for spending a few minutes here at the Quotive Corner. If this gave you something to think about, something to notice the next time a pattern starts to repeat, then the quote has already done its job. Because as we always say, wisdom isn't in the quote, it's in the reflection. We'll meet again in the next episode.